Hi, everyone. Thank you for being on here. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes as people get in, and then we'll get started. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, we'll get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name's Jack. I edit Phenomenal World. And I'm really excited to be introducing the event today. I started talking about this many months ago with Clara, Pedro, and Max. When I met Pedro and Clara from MAGI, the Center for Macroeconomic Research on Inequality at the University of São Paulo, who are doing incredible work on Brazil's fiscal rule, the Teto de Gastos, and the new fiscal framework, which became a central feature of debate in the new Lula administration. And with Max from Dezernat, who had similarly produced incredible research on Germany's Schuldenbremse. And I couldn't be more excited to bring these two conversations together, Latin America and Europe, Brazil and Germany, helmed by a truly incredible researcher, and Alex, who's our moderator for today, and with whom next week I'm really excited to say we'll be hosting a book launch for his new book on the IMF and the global impacts of austerity. Very relevant topics to our discussion today on the politics of fiscal rules. So I will pass it to Alex to kick us off, and I will just drop in the chat here a link for anyone who is not a subscriber to Phenomenal World. Please sign up there to stay tuned for upcoming events. Thank you all again so much for being here, and I'll pass it to you, Alex.
Many thanks, Jack, and welcome everyone to this fantastic event. So to start off, I mean, to get all on the same page, what is a fiscal rule? Of course, as most of you will know, it's this long-lasting constraint on fiscal policies through some kind of limits on budgetary aggregates, like limits the fiscal deficit. So the IMF, the world's guardian of fiscal orthodoxy, defines or says that fiscal rules typically aim to correct government's incentives to overspend in order to ensure fiscal responsibility and debt sustainability. Right, in the EU, those of you who follow European political economy may recall these limits of 60% of debt to GDP ratio or 3% deficit limits that many countries actually did not comply with. But more broadly, fiscal rules are quite prevalent across the world. More than half the countries in the world have some sort of fiscal rules. However, even though in principle they're intended to provide incentives for governments not to overspend, especially during good times, they also have key drawbacks. Strict fiscal rules may reduce the scope of governments to adjust policy in response to unexpected shocks like economic crisis, or equally importantly, they might limit the available spending that is necessary for making economies more resilient, not least to the risks posed by climate change. Evidence on fiscal rules from Latin America shows that public investment is the category of spending that is most adversely affected by fiscal rules. So for these reasons, understanding the political economy of these rules is more important than ever. They really form part of the fiscal infrastructure of contemporary capitalism, both in the global north and in the global south. So to unpack these issues, we really could not have wished for a better panel. In order of appearance, the first to take the floor will be Max Krahé, who's the research director of Dezernat Zukunft. Max has a PhD in political economy from Yale University and then held various postdoctoral positions while also building up Dezernat Zukunft, which he co-founded in 2018. Pedro Marques is the research coordinator at MAGI, the Research Center on Microeconomics and of Inequalities. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Sao Paulo, and his research focuses on the distributive aspects of contemporary Brazilian financialization, as well as the international monetary system. And Clara Brenck, who's an associate at MAGI, holds a PhD in economics from the New School, and her work focuses on inequality, debt dynamics, and taxation. Now, this event will last slightly more than an hour, and please, we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box, and then when the interventions end, I will collect some of these questions and pose them to the speakers. So without further delay, let me pass over to Max for the first intervention on fiscal rules in Germany.
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction, and Jack for organizing this event. I'm very much looking forward to it. I'll just throw my slides up. There we go. I will say something about first the history, and then the functioning, and then the reform options for Germany's and the Eurozone's fiscal rules. And it makes sense to discuss them together because their history is intertwined. So very briefly, the history of Germany's fiscal rules begins with a debate in kind of the early 1990s, late 1980s. Germany used to have a golden rule fiscal rule, so you have to balance the budget, but you can go into a deficit to the volume of your investment spending. And the Constitutional Court was frustrated with this because nobody could delineate what precisely is investment and what isn't. Did a ruling in 1989 saying, look, you have to fix this, it needs to be more precise. And then that kicked off a debate around, well, how should these rules work? And that particular iteration of reform didn't really yield anything. They passed the reform that changed the process of drawing up the budget, but nothing really happened. Now, in parallel to this domestic German contestation of the fiscal rules, of course, the kind of Maastricht Treaty process happened, and the idea of linking German reunification with European monetary integration, all of that happened. And through the Maastricht process, you had these quantitative fiscal rules, the famous 3% limit on your annual deficit, and the 60%, the 60% limit on your debt to GDP ratio. And as then kind of history moved forward and frustration with the German fiscal rules bubbled up again, there was another ruling by the German Constitutional Court later that said, we're still not happy with this. The idea of doing something quantitative was suddenly in the room. And the next important moment was the early 2000s when Germany and France both broke the 3% limit for deficits. And in reaction to that, there was a reform of the European fiscal rules where everyone agreed, okay, you can breach those 3% temporarily, as long as over the medium run, you run a tight fiscal ship, and that was quantified as a 0.5% limit on your structural deficit. And then in 2006, 2007, there was a reform of German federalism. A commission was instituted that said, we need to look at how German federalism works, in particular how the fiscal federal relations work. And through the European reform in 2005, you had this idea, okay, we can do kind of structural deficit limits and all of that kind of stuff. And then the really decisive moment for the history of Germany's Schuldenbremse, the kind of current deficit rule, was 2008, where this federal reform effort had to be done because there were elections in 2009. And so if you wanted to change the constitution, you had to kind of start the process in 2008, and you had the financial crisis. And out of that moment, you had a constellation where the conservatives said, okay, we will only agree to a fiscal stimulus, which everyone said, okay, it would be necessary because of the financial crisis. They said, we will only agree to a fiscal stimulus. We harmonize them, align them with these European rules, which are quantitatively precise, and not this kind of loose golden rule, which the Constitutional Court has criticized multiple times. And so out of this moment, you got the Schuldenbremse, the debt brake, which is still in place and it's in the Constitution. So removing it is very hard. You need a 2/3 majority, which means in particular, you will always need the German conservatives, the CDU, CSU, to agree to any reform. And then kind of that's why it's so hard to dislodge. The European fiscal rules, they kept evolving after this. There were kind of reforms in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, six-pack, two-pack, fiscal compact. Not that interesting to go into the details. It suffices to say that they've become extremely complicated, and I'll say a little bit about their function. So that much on the history. On the functioning, very briefly, the German debt brake, the way it works is it's a limit on the deficit. It completely ignores debt levels. It has no interest in the debt stock, only in the annual deficit. And it limits the annual deficit to a structural deficit of 0.35% of GDP. But then there's a cyclical component. So if you're in a recession, you can spend a little bit more. And if the economy is doing well, you have to tighten your ship a little bit. And the operationalization of that is a complicated story. I'll say a little bit about that when it comes to reform options. European rules, the way that they work today, there's a preventive arm, which is meant to prevent countries from getting into trouble in the first place. Centerpiece of that is the so-called medium-term objective, which basically says run your deficit, your fiscal policy, so that you have a 0.5% GDP structural deficit. Then there's the corrective arm. So if you're kind of getting out of hand, this kicks in, and that means you have to have a deficit, a plain deficit, so not cyclically adjusted, of less than 3%, and your debt to GDP ratio should be lower than 60%. And if you violate those, an excessive deficit procedure, EDF, will be initiated. But the big difference between the German rules and the European rules is the German rules are immediately binding. If the German government breaks them, you can sue it in front of the Constitutional Court. It's kind of a very hard quantitative limit with legally binding nature. The European rules, if you break them, procedures are initiated, and those procedures are long, they're complicated, there are various stages of political voting between the member states. So the bottom line about the European rules is don't be fooled by the kind of apparently precise numbers. They are far more political than the German rules are. They're also very complicated. The numbers I've given you, they're kind of complication in the background. The guide to it, this thing I've shown is about 100 pages now. It used to be 200 pages, but yeah. Briefly on reform options, what can be done about those fiscal frameworks? Maybe one step back. Why are reforms necessary? And then a few thoughts on the German situation and on the European situation. Why are reforms necessary? One thing that is very visible in Europe's macroeconomic performance from the 2010s is that, at least back then, the European economy, and in particular the Eurozone, suffered from a lot of slack, from high unemployment, very low interest rates, very low inflation. All the macroeconomic indicators were showing, look, there's plenty of spare capacity that's not being used. Monetary policy was at the zero lower bound, or the effective lower bound, and even with quantitative easing, couldn't really push the economy to full employment. And what it did had all sorts of side effects on asset prices, housing, blah, blah, blah. So there was a clear case for more fiscal stimulus, but that kept running into the fiscal rules. And so there's a case for reforming them. in Germany, this is what we've worked on at Dezernat Zukunft for a few years now. In Germany, you have the problem that the kind of high-level structure of our fiscal rule is in the constitution, and changing the constitution is hard. But when you look very closely, you see that this cyclical component, so the amount by which you can spend a little bit more or you have to spend a little bit less than the 0.35% that you can always do, the cyclical component, how to calculate that, that's not in the constitution. That's governed by ordinary law. In particular, it's actually governed by a decree, and so the government could change that very quickly. And so that's something that we zoomed in on and said, look, why don't we think about this and see if there's space for improvement here. I'm not going to walk you through the details of what could be done there, but at a higher kind of high level, the way that it currently works is that you have a projection of potential output, and you have a projection of what you expect actual GDP to be. And between these two projections, you can kind of look at the gap. And if your projected actual GDP is significantly below your projected potential output, you have a so-called output gap. So the numbers tell you you're running below potential, and that then generates additional spending space. Now, the thing is that especially potential output is unobservable. And in nature of being unobservable, the calculations to estimate this are a little bit like voodoo. You know, there's a high degree of discretion in how to do that, and there are better and worse ways of doing it. And we've published some ideas for how to improve that. And depending on the situation, the macroeconomic situation, those reform ideas can yield significant additional spending space, could be in kind of 0.5% of GDP range. And depending on how you do it, this could be structural. So each year, that's something that we're pushing for. There's a process ongoing at the moment that looks into it. The government is looking into this, and we're engaged in some kind of bureaucratic trench warfare with the relevant civil servants and the relevant ministries that do these calculations. And we're trying to convince them that there's a better way of doing this. At the European level, there's a reform effort currently going on around the fiscal rules. And the European Commission has tabled a proposal which would put a new tool in the fiscal rules toolbox. And this new tool are debt sustainability analyses, something that comes from the IMF originally. And here the kind of key element of the reform effort that we think is worth highlighting is just how extended the time frame is. So the way that these debt sustainability analyses are meant to work is the member states put forward spending plans of 4 to 7 years duration, and then you start your debt sustainability analysis at the end of those spending plans, so T+4 or T+7, and you look over a time frame of 10 years. That means, and then at the end of that time frame, your debt to GDP ratio has to be lower. That means you're looking over 14 to 17 years. You're projecting debt to GDP ratios over 14 to 17 years. Obviously, those projections are going to be extremely assumption driven. That means if you think of, okay, you know, what's going on here, what's worth pushing for in this reform effort, what's worth doing, one thing is maybe kill the reform. It's not obvious that this is going to be an improvement over the current rules. The current rules are very strict, but kind of killing this reform effort means that when they come back next year, the rules have been suspended during COVID, they're going to come back next year. When they come back, it might be politically so untenable that this could be a reset button, and space could be created for a better version of the reform. If that's not possible, then at least prevent the worst. Germany is currently pushing for a quantitative benchmark, something like if you're not meeting the targets, you have to tighten your budget by 0.5% of GDP every year. We believe that is kind of a flag. So you're not meeting this, so you have to do it and say, if you do tightening, you're going to be all clear. Go, you can do whatever you want. If you're tightening, then we have to do the whole DSA process. That would be extremely important, because you could then shove a lot of politics into the DSA process and avoid kind of automatic tightening from taking place, which would otherwise take place. The other key thing would be to look at the assumptions inside the DSAs, given the long time horizon of which you're projecting. Interest rate assumptions are extremely important. If you use market-based interest rate assumptions, you have the risk of doom loops. Let's say Italy's expected interest rates look bad. You're going to do a DSA. The DSA, on the basis of bad interest rates, will give you even worse results. And then the markets look at that DSA and think, oh, everything's terrible. We're going to drive up spreads even more. So to prevent this kind of doom loop, you should not use market interest rates in your assumptions for the DSA. And then lastly, and I'll finish with this, is of course how to do those DSAs. They're very technical, lots of assumptions. The framework for that will need to be updated and evolved and changed and discussed. The way that the current European rules work is you have the so-called output gap working group, and that's kind of staffed by civil servants from the various national ministries. And extremely important discussions happen there. It's all very technical, but politically highly consequential. Replace that body with something that's more political, more transparent, where you have similar discussions. This stuff needs to be discussed, but don't do it in the shadows. Do it publicly and be honest about the politics of that. I'll leave it here, and I look forward to hearing about the Brazilian rules.
Many thanks, Max, for this super informative presentation, and I'm sure we will get into a very interesting discussion about it in a moment. But first, let me pass over to Pedro and Clara for their intervention on Brazilian fiscal rules.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Max, for the presentation, and thank you, Jack, for inviting us here. I will share our presentation here. Just a second. So Clara and I, we will talk a little bit about Brazil's case right now. And I will start by explaining a little bit which is the problem and the issue that we have now in Brazil and how we're dealing with it in a way. Since 2016, we have been through a spending cap fiscal rule, which is called teto dos gastos. And this rule prohibited government spending to increase in real terms for 20 years. Basically, it freezed government spending in Brazil for 20 years. At that time, some economists and specialists, they argued against this rule, and they said that, well, things will not be able to keep up with the state activity with this rule. But the consensus around the difficulty regarding the spending cap only came in 2020 when the pandemic crisis showed that the limit to the government spending would not be able to incorporate emergency expenditures. So as you can see in this graph, in 2020, the total expenditure increased a lot, and the expenditure subject to the spending cap was not able to incorporate it. Overall, what we have here is that the spending cap rule in Brazil has been diminishing the capacity of the state and the state ability to spend and its size in a overall sense. It was already expected in the last year that probably the one who would be elected in the general elections would have to propose an alternative or a reform of the spending cap. Fortunately, we had Lula's victory, and now it's him and the Workers' Party who are responsible for proposing a new framework. Clara will explain to us a little bit more about this framework after, but I would like to go back and in history a little bit, to discuss a little bit how we adopt this strict rule as the spending cap is. The origins of the spending cap are around 2013, 2014, as you can see in this graph, when fiscal surpluses became fiscal deficits in Brazil. The fiscal responsibility law, which was the fiscal rule at that time in force, was a rule that was established in 2000 in a way to complement the inflation targeting regime in Brazil that was being established. And it proposed that the government, it was not a constitutional law as the spending cap was. I forgot to mention it, but it's important as Max was talking before. And it was not a constitutional law, the fiscal responsibility law. And it obliged the government to define fiscal results targets each year. So we had this planning, this predictability of the fiscal policy for some time. What's interesting here is that the Workers' Party government, which Lula is the most representative, always been actually, came to power in Brazil in 2003, and the fiscal responsibility law started in 2000. During the whole period of Workers' Party government, the fiscal responsibility law was in force. You can see that until 2013, so in the first years of the governments, they had no difficulty to comply with the fiscal responsibility law. Fiscal surpluses occurred, and the debt to GDP ratio was falling down until 2013. The problem is that right after in this period, 2013-2014, the fiscal deficits led to a sharp increase in the debt to GDP ratio in Brazil. And this was so strong that mobilized a kind of pro-austerity discourse in Brazil, a little bit motivated by right-wing opposition, but also by traditional media that tried to blame the Workers' Party government of being a little bit irresponsible and negligent with fiscal policy, even despite this whole trajectory of the debt GDP ratio from 2003 to 2013. In this context, so the discourse gained force, and it was responsible for changes in the political system in Brazil, and also responsible for the spending cap approval. But it's interesting to understand which were the economic dynamics that were behind this pro-austerity surge, let's say. And we, looking at the literature, and we can see that distributive questions related to the way the growth model envisioned by the Workers' Party during this period were important to motivate this rise in pro-austerity discourse. As you may know, Brazil during the 2000s was part of this larger experience of Latin American countries called Pink Tide, in which left-wing governments profited from international and domestic favorable conditions to increase government expanding social policy and reduce poverty and inequality levels. So during this period, it was common that social spending, both in real terms and share of GDP, increased. You can see here in this graph that in Brazil, it was exactly the case. Social spending increased in real terms and as a share of GDP during the whole period. The problem was that during the booming years of the 2000s, related to the commodity booms and the domestic demand boom also, the fiscal responsibility law the government managed to comply with the fiscal responsibility law, even increasing social spending. The problem was that when the economy started to decelerate around 2011, the falling trend in growth trajectory affected revenues, but it did not change the trajectory of social spending, especially in Brazil, talking about Brazilian case here. So what we had was that falling revenue trajectory and increasing trajectory of social spending that compromised fiscal responsibility law around 2014, 2015. What's interesting to note here is that this trajectory of social policy or social spending is resilient. And this is because we don't have time to explore it here, and you can talk about it later because this is important for the new rule that Clara will present. But this is related to several redistributive mechanisms in Brazilian constitution that allow the government spending to increase when you take some decisions such as the increase of the minimum wage value. So we can go back later, but just to say that the Workers' Party redistributive model was structurally put in practice, and it would be difficult to stop it only by politics or by policy action. What happened was that the reaction came in two ways. First, the reaction came politically, and the President Dilma Rousseff, Lula's successor, was removed from power in 2016. But more importantly, the reaction came in, just to say that she was removed because of charged accusations of committing fiscal crimes and fiscal policy crimes, actually. And but more important than this was the spending cap rule that was supposed to stop and halt this process of increasing social spending, and it did, actually, as we can see by that. In the end, what we have is that from 2016 to 2022, the spending cap was the fiscal rule in Brazil. It was a constitutional rule. And in 2022, Lula was re-elected against Bolsonaro with a very strict margin and a large coalition of democratic left-wing, leftists, and center-right, but counted also with a Congress that was not very, how can I say this, interesting for the agenda of the Workers' Party government that we saw in the pink tide. This is the condition that is settled this year, 2023, when Lula and his team present the fiscal rule that Clara will explain to us now.
Thank you. So, yeah, you can pass the slide, Pedro.
Okay.
So as Pedro said, we start 2023 with a left-wing government from the Workers' Party in Lula, but with this hard coalition that still we have to kind of give them also a little bit of conditions to make them trust that the Workers' Party is not going to break the country again. So we have this discourse that the Workers' Party almost broke the country in the past, and this is why we have the teto de gastos, but it was also known that the teto de gastos was not sustainable. So as Pedro mentioned, we knew that before, but after the pandemic, that became a consensus. So because there was a very strict rule that didn't allow any growth of the government spending, all the candidates in 2022 were already discussing what would be the new fiscal rule that I'm going to propose if I'm elected. So the year starts and everyone knows that this government is going to have to propose a new rule. And they do that, proposing a new rule that's also restrictive, as we will see. It's better than the teto de gastos, but it's also very restrictive. And it's very dependent on tax revenues and makes a lot of contradictions when we look at the need for social spending and for investment and for even for some promises that the government made when it was elected. It's very contradictory because it's not going to fit in this new rule. And it's highly dependent on the revenues, and also we think that the government's also very dependent on the private sector to foster this growth that will then give them revenues and then allow them to spend a little bit more. So talking about the rule itself, so the government proposed a rule that allows real growth, that actually establishes a minimum of real primary expenditures growth of 0.6%. So first of all, it connects the real growth of expenditures to the real growth of revenues. So it allows that expenditures to grow 70% of the growth rate of revenues of the previous year if we are meeting the target of the primary result. So just like the fiscal responsibility law, the government needs to establish a target for the primary result. But now it's a little bit more flexible, because then this target has kind of a range that it can be less 0.25 percentage points or above 0.25 percentage points. So it's not a number itself. So if you say, well, my primary target is 1% positive, if you end up having 0.8%, that's fine, because you have a range of adjustment of this primary target. So if you're within this range of your primary target that you established 1 year before, you can spend 70% of whatever the growth of revenues was in the previous year. So it's already a surplus rule, because you're limiting 70% of expenditure. But it has a counter-cyclical mechanism that makes that expenditure, that 70%, needs to be within a range of 0.6% and 2.5%. So if the economy is growing too much, and if your revenues grew 5% in the previous year, 70% of that would be 3.5, but then you have a cap of 2.5. So if the economy is growing too much, you cannot you increase your expenditures that much. So you have a cap of 2.5%. On the other hand, if you are on a crisis and you have the revenues going down, you also have a limit of 0.6%. So you don't need to cut expenditures. You can grow 0.6% in real terms. So it guarantees a minimum, but it also has a limit that makes this counter-cyclical movement. If you don't meet the primary target, so if you're below the minus 0.5 percentage points of your target, then there are some things that you have to change. So first, there are a little bit of expenditures that you cannot increase, like you cannot increase the wages of your public services and all that. But you also have your limit established at 50% of the growth of revenues, which is here the purple line. So if the primary target is not met, you have to grow 50% of the revenues growth, also staying between the 0.6 and 2.5. So it's a little bit more complicated rule, but again, it allows real growth, but it has this counter-cyclical movement and all that. And more important, it also establishes a minimum for investment, which is something that, as Alex mentioned, we in Latin America is the first thing that we cut when we have to cut expenditures, usually investment, and then public investment is very compromised in the last years. So it tries to bring it back to the rule, but it's also problematic, as I will talk later. Just the next slide. So it's a better rule, but it's still very restricting. So if you compare with what was the expenditure on the previous government of the Workers' Party, so basically Lula 1, 2, and the first government of Dilma, because the second one, she was impeached, as Pedro mentioned, it's much lower than what was spent. So the government has much less space and all the public spending that it needs to do with social spending, for example. And it also reduces the size of the state related to GDP, as the next slide shows, over time, because of course it is a rule that restricts 70% of expenditure of growth of revenue. So if the GDP is growing a lot, which is the most optimistic case in our purple line here, the size of the government is going down more severely because we have the counter-cyclical rule that limits the growth of the state. So even if revenues are growing a lot, the state cannot spend too much because of the counter-cyclical movement. So this brings us to a very complicated situation, because it shows that we will not be able to sustain this rule for a long time, or if we choose to sustain this rule, we have to change our public spending. So we will have to change the rule that gives us a minimum for spending in health and education, for example, for the public sector. Or we will have to cut all the benefits that the government gives to the people, such as the Bolsa Familia, for example. So the minimum wage, as Pedro said, has something that is very connected to government expenditures because many of the benefits are tied to the minimum wage. So if you value the minimum wage, public expenditures also increase. And then if you increase revenues, you also have a rule that connects health and education to those revenues, and then that increases. But then you have a cap of the new rule that doesn't allow the overall spending to increase. And in the end, what will actually happen is that investments will again be left out because the rule establishes a minimum for investment, but it's a budgetary minimum. You don't need to actually invest that much. You have to have certain amount of money separated for investment in the budget, but when you are actually doing the spending, you don't necessarily need to spend that much. So you can cut investment if, for example, revenues are less than you expected. So in the end, to conclude, because we've already out of time, it's still a very strong austerity rule. And the most interesting thing is that it was not even discussed, like the government proposed this rule in the way that it is, and it was not even discussed, for example, the 2.5 or the 0.6 or the 70% or the 50%, those numbers, and that the functioning of the rule was not even discussed because the discourse was that we need a rule that restricts government spending in some way. And then the discourse was actually how do we limit more if we don't meet the primary target. So all the discussion on the Congress and the Senate was about that. So the Workers' Party, which is a government that increased spending and knows and thinks about the importance of government spending in the economy, is proposing this rule. It shows how strong for us the austerity discourse is, and leaves a lot of the growth to the market, because again, the amount of public spending that you have in that rule will be enough only for social spending and not for investments. If even you maybe even have to cut social spending in some way from that rule. And then leaves the question, so what kind of government are we, or the size of the state that we are proposing? And it's again contradictory because the government, a Workers' Party that promises an increase in social spending and reduction of inequality and all those things, proposes a rule that's very restricting and it's not allowing them to do that. So just to finish with a quote from the paper or the article that Pedro and I wrote for Phenomenal World recently. The fiscal rules claim to insulate fiscal policy from political influence, but this is its own form of politics. So it constrains and reduces the space for the working class whenever in power to influence fiscal policy and pursue redistribution. Sorry, we spent more time. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these fantastic presentations. For those of you in the audience, please do jump in with any questions you'll have. I'll be very happy to pose them to the speakers, but maybe to get us started, let me make a question or a two-part question to vis-a-vis both presentations. I think what we heard a lot about and what is so concerning in a way is that we see these fiscal rules kind of exiting the sphere of the fiscal architecture of the state and entering the sphere of the legal architecture of the state by being constitutionalized, right? So they fundamentally transform the political economy and the ways in which different politicians as well as civil society can engage with these rules. Like this was, for example, clear in Max's presentation, where part of the Schuldenbremse that relates to the structural deficit cannot be touched, right? So we only can play around with how we understand the cyclical component. and this constitutionalization dynamic, of course, yields a set of pressures and politics of its own. Now, my question to Max, to get us started, is, well, I think you did this very good job at discussing kind of the interplay between the German level politics and the European politics and the discussions at the European level. Now, your recommendations were about moving away from this expert working group deciding on the application of rules and moving towards more high-level politics to shape them. Now, my question to that, in principle, I agree, and you call for more transparency, and who's against transparency? On the other hand, doesn't transparency also yield a lot of perhaps unwanted international politics? Like, you can only remember the discourse around the profligate Southern Europeans who sit around having siestas, drinking coffee all day, and kind of the hardworking Dutch people and Germans and Finns who are, working 12, 14-hour days and saving a lot of money to subsidize the lazy Southerners, right? And if we have this more high-level political approach, won't this invite that sort of politics, on which politics parties like the AfD and other populist right-wing parties kind of build their entire raison d'etre? And then to switch to Pedro and Clara, I think this was this very clear-eyed presentation about challenges facing the Lula administration on the fiscal front. Although kind of on the positive side, in Brazil, it's not only fiscal rules that are constitutionalized, but also social expenditures that are constitutionalized. So, you ended with this comment on how the fiscal rules basically limits the ability of governments to spend on the working class, to live up to their the fiscal promises they made during their electoral campaigns, and I understand that, but isn't there the scope, especially if we take this distributional lens that you introduced, isn't there a scope, if cuts need to happen, to make those cuts in a way that they disproportionately affect those with higher incomes who are able to purchase health services or educational services on private markets, thus protecting those of lower socioeconomic status? So in a way, change, if the pie of social spending has to remain the same in real terms, presumably governments still have a leeway in order how to allocate where the burden falls. Does it fall on the middle class and the rich, or does it fall on the working class? So if you could elaborate on those, on whether there is actually any distributional, any space for distributional adjustment when it comes to the fiscal priorities of the government. Thank you.
Would you want me to start, or Clara and Pedro, given that I started the last time? Okay, great. I hear you on the politics of discussing fiscal rules within Europe having been ugly in the past, but I would say two things. I'd say firstly, the fundamental problem is the politics and not the discussion. If I kind of think back to the change in the discussions over time, I would say that they started, very, very, very ugly, and over the course of the 2010s got better, frankly. I think it took a long time and way longer than it did in the Anglosphere, but I think eventually the European discussion moved towards this form of austerity is destructive, and there is a room for improvement in the fiscal rules. And by 2019, we'd got to a place where I think the old fiscal rules were viewed quite skeptically, even in countries like Germany and the Netherlands. And so the result of that was that when COVID hit, very quickly, both the German rules and the European rules were suspended. And there were pretty significant stimulus packages, which, as in the US, led to a far faster exit macroeconomically from the crisis. So I think, the politics, especially in the early 2010s, were really ugly, but discussing that made it better over time. Now, two further thoughts now. One is the politics of not discussing it. They're arguably worse, because the rules as they are currently being proposed, once again, they're not going to work, especially if they're too tight. And then you have two outcomes. You haven't discussed those rules publicly, but they're terrible rules. It's not going to be productive to stick to them. So then either you kind of really wreck Southern European economies in an attempt to stick to them, and then you get huge resentment in the South, which is already kind of a fundamental issue. Or out of realism, you say, well, let's not stick to the rules, and especially if France flips, that could be an option. But then in kind of the German and Dutch political sphere, people are going to say, no one's sticking to the rules, and then you're going to get trouble politically in the North. So the kind of politics of not discussing it aren't great either. And then last thought on the actual politics going forwards, I do think that the 2020s are more hopeful for better fiscal rules in Europe than the 2010s were. And I think that's the case because of a possible switch in the French position. In terms of public debate, the French have been in favor of more reasonable fiscal rules, macroeconomically appropriate, space for investment, that kind of stuff. But when push came to shove in the 2010s, they didn't stick up for that because they didn't really need it. And it would have been politically costly against Germany. I think in the 2020s, if you look what's happening now, the French are very keen on fundamentally refurbishing their nuclear fleet. That's precisely the kind of thing that's very expensive and fully appropriately financed through debt, right? These are extremely long-lived assets. So you do this in actually allowing more leverage, have to be sensible leverage, be careful where you spend the money, but leverage up if it's good. And if the French really push for allowing higher leverage, then I think discussing this kind of stuff publicly and saying, these kinds of investments, they're going to have growth effects, your DFA is going to look good, have those in the open, have the discussion, build the trust, and hopefully get better fiscal rules through it.
So I will answer here. Thanks. Well, I just want to have a comment first, which is, it's interesting what Alex told us about the changing nature from economic to legal character of fiscal rules. And I think that two points related to it. The first is that in this time in Brazil, I think that this legal size was diminished since we have been through all this punishment in Dilma's government regarding the budget management, and then we had this constitutional law in the spending cap that halted us our capacity of doing a public policy. So I think this is a thing interesting in the new fiscal rule in Brazil, that it's not constitutional and it diminishes it takes off the punishment when it's not when you cannot, when you have, don't reach the results, you are not punished in a legal way, but you're punished in an economic way. So this is an interesting thing that this new rule puts. But going to the next, the question that Alex put regarding this opposition between fiscal rule and social expenditure in Brazil, since they are both were constitutional and now they are being put in at stake. I think that what we are seeing now in this new rule is a policy option by the government to endorse social assistance programs, such as the Bolsa Familia and income transfer programs in a general way, and entering a trade-off, which means that they will probably have to reduce provisions related to public health and education and related to pensions and social security. So it's kind of an option that's really, it seems to me that is related to a new form of the Brazilian state in a way of doing social policy, opting for social assistance and income transfer policy rather than public health and education in a way that would remind us of the welfare state, or European welfare state, or something like this. And in this case, the ones, if it's something that it's going to happen, whether it is, we don't know, but if it happens, it will punish the poorest one too. Because even though social assistance is important to take people from extreme poverty, they do not take them from poverty. And what's important in Brazil is that a large public health system, which is free and universal, and a large university and public schools system, which allows the poorest strata of the Brazilian population to have access to education and health in a free way. And it's almost clear to us, to me and Clara, that changing by adapting the size of social spending and the type of social spending inside the new rule, this will probably lead to a reduction, a significant reduction in public health and public education provisions, especially because they will have to change the constitutional rule regarding these two.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Let me take some more questions together that touch upon some of these discussions we've been having already. The first one, which they're all raised in the Q&A box, and I encourage more questions to be posed there, has to do with the relationship between fiscal policy and monetary policy. And there's this usual assumption that there is some degree of coordination. Of course, fiscal policy is administered by ministries of finance, whereas monetary policy by independent or supposedly independent central banks. So I would like your views on to what extent fiscal rules work in tandem or can work in tandem with monetary orthodoxy, and whether we can reform fiscal rules without reforming central bank mandates in the first place. And then I'll start with Brazil first, and then Germany. So question in Brazil is, why is the country so worried about deficit and debt, right? Brazilian debt is mostly denominated in reais, and it's domestic debt. So is this concern just simply pure ideology, or does it make economic sense? Is there some kind of fundamental dynamic in Brazilian debt and deficit that gives a very strong argument for fiscal conservatism, or are they just terrified of having to go back to the IMF? If you could elaborate on the on kind of why they're so worried, given that composition of the debt structure. And then on to Max is a question on where you would see the priority for the immediate next steps regarding strengthening the EU's fiscal capacity in order to ensure the spending needed for the Green Deal that, as we know, the current Commission has turned into one of the cornerstones of its term, which is, of course, coming to an end in a bit less than a year, next summer. So one option, of course, is to reform the fiscal rules, but another option could be on establishing a permanent fiscal capacity through some kind of permanent investment fund, maybe modeled after the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which would remain outside existing fiscal rules. So how do you see these options, and how can you see a vision, a future for fiscal rules in light of stated priorities on the green transition? So maybe let's start with Pedro and Clara first, and then go to Max.
Thank you for the questions. I think the answer for both questions are related. So as Pedro mentioned right in the beginning, we couldn't explore it too much, but the origins of the fiscal rules in Brazil are the inflation targeting regime. So we had a period with very high inflation rates, and in order to control that, we had a change in our currency and a change in the whole system that ended up with that we call the macroeconomic tripod, which is the inflation targeting regime in the monetary side, and then the fiscal responsibility law in the fiscal side. So it has this idea that, of course, that is the mainstream idea, that you have to control government spending, otherwise you're gonna lose control of inflation. And to give you an idea, in the beginning of this year, we had our nominal interest rates at 13.75% in nominal terms. In real terms, around 8%. And the central bank's argument to maintain that for a couple of months was, we are waiting to see what the fiscal rule will be. So you have this hard situation where indeed the inflation targeting regime, kind of what we call the monetary dominance over the fiscal policy. And then, of course, if you want to control the debt, the evolution of the debt, imagine having a debt that's growing related to an interest rate of 13.75%. So you do have economists that say, well, to control the debt, to not leave it to explode, it's simple. You just have to reduce interest rates. But then to reduce interest rates, you change the whole macroeconomic tripod, because you reduce interest rates, then you move the exchange rate to a different path, and then you affect inflation. And that's our biggest fear in Brazil. So I think we have a little bit of a trauma on that really, really high inflation rates. And then all the discourse is around controlling inflation, including the fiscal policy discourse, and not only the monetary policy. So I think there is it's a lot, the fear of growing the debt. It was used, in my opinion, in Dilma times for her impeachment as an ideological discourse, because there was no actual evidence that it was exploding and it was going to be crazy. And then, as the question mentions, we have our debt in reais, so it wouldn't be a problem with external debt or anything like that. We had a lot of dollars in the government. I forgot the name now, but I think it was used ideologically, and there are economists that argue for something that it's not that restrict, given the characteristics of our debt. But the mainstream discourse is this, and this is how the macroeconomic structure is in Brazil, and it's very hard to change because, especially of the inflation targeting regime and then the inflation past and all that.
Okay, so fiscal monetary coordination, and then how to finance the Green Deal. On fiscal monetary coordination, I think, of course, it makes sense. And in a well-functioning macroeconomic regime, you would absolutely coordinate these two in order to kind of get the macroeconomic outcomes you want. In the European context, the European Central Bank has actually been a fairly cooperative player in my reading, at least, and arguably they have already put a key component in place for improving the European macro financial architecture. They've put in place this so-called transmission protection instrument, which is basically a protective umbrella for states like Italy, whose interest rates might increase through spreads over Germany. And the ECB has said, as long as you meet certain criteria, including abiding by the fiscal rules, as long as you abide by those criteria, we're going to buy your bonds and we're going to keep it under control. So the ECB is saying, if you play by the rules, we're going to make sure your interest rates are fine. This puts the weight on the rules. If the rules are reasonable, then you can actually stick to them and you're going to be under the ECB umbrella to, chop your leg off. And then suddenly you're between a rock and a hard place. Either you chop your leg off in order to abide by the rules and get the ECB protection, or you say, well, I quite like both my legs, and so I'm not going to do that. But then you're at the mercy of the bond markets and the ECB is not going to protect you. So really the operative thing that's preventing reasonable cooperation between monetary and fiscal in Europe right now are the fiscal rules, and it's not the obstruction or excessive conservatism of the ECB. On the grid and kind of the rules reform should priority be kind of a successor instrument, a permanent investment facility model on the RRF. So just for reasons of German domestic politics, I don't see a permanent RRF or indeed a new RRF right now. One of the three coalition parties of the current government and the Conservatives in opposition, they've both made clear that they absolutely want to see how the RRF plays out. So they're not willing to touch this before 2027. And if you fast forward, the speed of spending in Italy, which is obviously the biggest beneficiary of this, is not really fast enough to call it a great success at this moment. We can have a discussion why that is, and probably most of it is having to do with the lack of administrative capacity in Italy due to kind of permanent austerity. But I just wouldn't put too much weight on the RRF or RRF replacement, at least right now. Fiscal rules reform, I think, are much more promising there, because the way that all of this is so technocratized means that if you get the right players to say, we absolutely want to have Green Deal financing in there, you can do things like make the projections, link the projections to kind of Green Deal spending. And you can say, look, if you do the right kind of green transformational spending, then we're going to assume a higher growth path, and a higher growth path is going to generate additional spending. So there I can see more promise. I don't know if it would happen if we actually tie up the reforms in the current iteration, because it's meant to be done by the end of this year. Don't know if that's going to happen, but squeezing it in by then, very, very tough. But yeah, I would go for fiscal rules, not so much RRF 2.0.
Many thanks. Thanks for all of your insights. We're at the 70-minute mark of this event, which is, I think, a good point to start wrapping up. I want to thank, of course, Jack and the Phenomenal World team for putting together this panel, but especially Clara and Pedro and Max for their interventions on Brazil and Germany. Now, I know that you have these fantastic reports and policy papers by Made and Dezernat Zukunft, respectively. And I encourage everyone to seek them out and read them. Already, Jack has posted the links to some of these reports. So I encourage everyone to consult them. Also, well, we discussed this before, but I imagine that we all agree that if you have any questions, comments, ideas based on what was said in this event, please do reach out to us by email or online somehow, on Twitter and so on. We're generally all very happy to engage. For those of you still interested in fiscal policy and social protection issues and so on, there will be one more event next week where we'll delve deeper into these issues. So look out for that announcement that will happen very soon. And thanks to everyone for joining our conversation. Have a nice morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.